SpongeBob possesses Toon Force, which is one of the most overpowered abilities in fiction, arguably the most powerful of them all. Now, what if I told you that every time SpongeBob lost an arm wrestling match or failed to lift something as simple as a wooden stick, he was actually holding back? There are several scenes that support this idea, while others seem to contradict it. One of the strongest examples comes from an episode where Squidward instructed SpongeBob to completely shut off his brain and focus only on serving food. He forgot everything else and became obsessed with nothing but his work. The important detail is that Squidward never told him to hold back his strength. As soon as SpongeBob entered this state, he immediately displayed some of the greatest feats in the entire series, surpassing many of his previous Toon Force moments. He effortlessly lifted more than 10 people with a single hand, well over 10 times his own body weight. Moments later, he began manipulating the environment itself, warping reality, multiplying his arms, and performing impossible actions as if they were completely normal. Since nobody instructed him to suppress his power, and he had forgotten everything except his assigned task, it's reasonable to assume that this may have been SpongeBob's true, unrestricted potential. Normally, he could simply be limiting himself without even realizing it. In this state, however, those mental limits disappeared, allowing his real power to show. This isn't the only example. In another episode, Squidward accidentally created what seemed to be an entirely bizarre clarinet dimension. It all started with a small box, but somehow it evolved into a strange, backrooms-like reality where the laws of physics completely broke down. SpongeBob seemed perfectly at home there, while Squidward desperately tried to catch him. It was impossible. Even when Squidward managed to grab SpongeBob, he instantly disappeared. New rooms appeared out of nowhere, the environment constantly changed, and reality itself became increasingly absurd. Everything behaved as if SpongeBob's imagination was unconsciously shaping the world around him. One of the most iconic examples of this comes from the famous imagination scene. SpongeBob and Patrick were sitting inside a cardboard box, while realistic sounds of explosions, crashes, and countless other events could be heard from outside. When someone looked inside the box, there was absolutely nothing except SpongeBob and Patrick. SpongeBob simply explained that it's all about imagination. That single line could imply that his imagination has virtually no limits. If he can imagine something, then within the rules of Toon Force, it can become reality. Returning to the previous example, I personally like to call that state SpongeBob's ignorant form. The version of him that thinks about nothing except his assigned task and unknowingly unleashes his full potential. Another great example involves the legendary golden spatula. Larry the Lobster, one of the physically strongest characters in Bikini Bottom, tried to pull it out but barely managed to move it. Then SpongeBob casually walked over because an elderly woman asked him where the restroom was. Without even paying attention, he accidentally pulled the golden spatula out as if it weighed nothing, simply so he could point her in the right direction. He wasn't trying. He wasn't focused. He did it completely subconsciously. This pattern appears throughout the series. SpongeBob's greatest feats usually happen when he isn't paying attention or isn't intentionally trying to show his strength. If we look for an in-universe explanation, it could mean that whenever he consciously enters a serious fight, he instinctively suppresses his own power. There are moments where he genuinely becomes angry or stops holding back emotionally, but even then, he rarely reaches the absurd level of power displayed during these completely carefree, absent-minded moments. He even fought Squidward in what could only be described as a Toon Force duel, where both characters manipulated reality and the environment around them. Officially, the fight ended in a draw, but to me, SpongeBob clearly controlled the battle for most of it. These are exactly the kinds of feats that can reasonably be compared to legendary Toon Force characters like Bugs Bunny or others of similar caliber. The best part is that SpongeBob is still an ongoing series. New episodes continue to release, meaning even greater feats could appear at any time. A recently released episode introduced a new character known as the Mime, whose abilities were incredibly impressive. He could manipulate reality by creating invisible objects out of thin air. Although these objects couldn't be seen, they still existed physically and had real effects on the world around him. It was as if his imagination alone was enough to make them real. Using these abilities, the mime fought a massive plankton robot and defeated it with surprising ease. What's especially interesting is what happened afterward. SpongeBob immediately began copying the mime's fighting style and entered what was essentially another Toon Force duel. Throughout the fight, the mime often seemed to have the upper hand, but SpongeBob also managed to counter many of his techniques. In the end, thanks to his own abilities, and admittedly, the narrative working in his favor, SpongeBob ultimately neutralized the mime. This suggests that SpongeBob may also be capable of using abilities similar to the mimes, adding yet another layer to his already incredible potential. Another recurring pattern throughout the series is that SpongeBob repeatedly surpasses the greatest specialists in Bikini Bottom. Whether it's Patrick's physical strength, Sandy's karate skills, Squidward's artistic talent, or the unique abilities of other residents, SpongeBob has managed to outperform them in their own fields on multiple occasions. This could imply that SpongeBob is capable of matching, or even surpassing, the abilities of virtually everyone in Bikini Bottom whenever the situation demands it. People often ask who would win in a fight between SpongeBob and Patrick. Personally, I think the answer is SpongeBob. There have certainly been scenes where Patrick physically overpowered him. However, there have also been moments where the two fought while both were giving a genuine effort, resulting in a draw. One particularly interesting scene shows Patrick hitting SpongeBob. SpongeBob simply says that he should be the winner, and Patrick immediately throws himself away and effectively defeats himself. This can be interpreted as a form of manipulation. Patrick is famously gullible, so convincing him to defeat himself isn't completely outside the realm of possibility. Even if SpongeBob doesn't always win through raw physical strength, he often finds creative, reality-bending ways to overcome stronger opponents. SpongeBob has also defeated Sandy in karate more than once. While that isn't necessarily his greatest accomplishment, it once again demonstrates how his Toon Force allows him to accomplish things that shouldn't be possible. When I refer to Toon Force, I'm mainly talking about abilities such as reality manipulation, environmental manipulation, cartoon-like elasticity, extreme regeneration, and occasional bursts of incredible speed. Another impressive feat involves a character commonly referred to as Doodlebob. SpongeBob literally drew this character into existence, and Doodlebob eventually became powerful enough to overpower SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, and several other characters physically. Yet despite this overwhelming strength, SpongeBob ultimately found a way to defeat him as well. SpongeBob also has another recurring ability, producing random objects seemingly out of nowhere whenever the situation requires them. Combined with his regeneration, this makes him extraordinarily difficult to defeat. Interestingly, these abilities don't appear consistently in every single episode. Sometimes he uses them freely, while in other situations they seem absent altogether. This inconsistency is fairly common among Toon Force characters and usually depends on the needs of the story. Another recent episode provides an important clue. Patrick effortlessly lifted objects simply because he didn't realize they were supposed to be too heavy. Since he never believed they were impossible to lift, he lifted them without any difficulty. While this is obviously one of Patrick's own feats, it may also explain SpongeBob's greatest moments. Many of SpongeBob's most absurd accomplishments happen when he isn't consciously thinking about them. He simply acts, and reality bends to accommodate him. This could explain why he has performed feats regardless of weight or scale, including moments where he manipulated objects on a planetary level, such as spinning the Earth with a single hand. Returning once again to what I call SpongeBob's ignorant form, the same episode provides another remarkable display of power. Off-screen, SpongeBob effortlessly tied up both Mr. Krabs and Patrick and completely neutralized them without any visible effort. That scene strongly suggests that, in that state, he physically surpassed both of them with ease. Another unforgettable feat comes from the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, 2004, where SpongeBob transformed into a gigantic, immensely powerful form through nothing but the strength of his own will, ultimately saving the citizens of Bikini Bottom. Finally, there's the episode involving the Tattletale Strangler. The Strangler was feared throughout Bikini Bottom because of his overwhelming physical strength. nearly everyone was terrified of him, except SpongeBob and, for the most part, Patrick. Disguised as SpongeBob's bodyguard, the Strangler tried repeatedly to eliminate him. However, SpongeBob constantly manipulated the situation in bizarre ways, driving the Strangler closer and closer to insanity. At one point, SpongeBob accidentally revealed that he already knew his bodyguard was actually the Strangler all along.
Thanks.
Don't mention it, Strangler. I mean bodyguard. Now, where did I put my key?
If that's true, then everything SpongeBob did afterward, including hiding the key under the doormat and deliberately placing the Strangler into increasingly absurd situations, was completely intentional. Eventually, the hunter became the hunted. The Strangler desperately tried to escape, but SpongeBob somehow appeared everywhere he went, constantly showing up in impossible ways until the Strangler himself was forced to run away. To me, this perfectly represents SpongeBob's true nature. His greatest strength isn't simply physical power. It's the limitless possibilities created by his imagination and his Toon Force. Overall, all of these feats lead me to one conclusion. I believe SpongeBob is the strongest character in the entire SpongeBob universe. Some people argue that the Flying Dutchman deserves that title because of his supernatural powers. However, I always remember the episode where the Flying Dutchman entered SpongeBob's mind, only to become overwhelmed by the absurdity inside it. Even a being as powerful as the Dutchman couldn't fully handle SpongeBob's imagination. To me, that's one of the clearest demonstrations of SpongeBob's true potential. When you combine his Toon Force, reality manipulation, regeneration, plot armor, limitless imagination, and countless impossible feats, SpongeBob consistently stands above every other character in Bikini Bottom. Of course, there are episodes where someone temporarily defeats him in hand-to-hand combat, knocks him down, or appears physically stronger. However, I don't think those moments define his actual power. Toon Force characters are rarely limited by conventional logic. Their abilities fluctuate depending on the story, but their greatest feats reveal what they're truly capable of. One of SpongeBob's most consistent abilities is his incredible regeneration. Even after suffering absurd levels of damage, he almost always comes back as if nothing happened. In one memorable scene, Patrick unraveled him using the famous string, yet SpongeBob's laughter could still be heard, showing that he remained completely unharmed, despite what happened to his body. If that's how his abilities fundamentally work, then permanently defeating him may simply be impossible. No matter what happens, he always returns. That alone makes him extraordinarily difficult to eliminate. I also don't believe SpongeBob is nearly as unintelligent as he appears. Patrick is usually portrayed as the less intelligent one, while SpongeBob often seems childish and naive. Yet, there are many moments where SpongeBob clearly manipulates situations to his own advantage. The episode with the Tattletale Strangler is one example, but there are several others where he quietly controls events without anyone realizing it. This reminds me of other legendary Toon Force users such as Bugs Bunny or Woody Woodpecker, who often pretend to be harmless while secretly controlling the entire situation. For that reason, I believe SpongeBob intentionally hides much of his true capability. Considering all of his feats, the way the series presents him, and the narrative logic behind Toon Force itself, SpongeBob appears to be the strongest character in his own universe. Future episodes may introduce even greater feats, making him even more powerful than he already seems. If someone asked me what SpongeBob would be capable of if he used every single one of his abilities simultaneously, without holding back at all, my answer would be simple. He would be unimaginably powerful. If his imagination truly has no meaningful limits, then every ability we've seen could theoretically work together at once. His reality manipulation, regeneration, elasticity, speed, environmental manipulation, object creation, and every other Toon Force ability could all be used simultaneously. At that point, describing his strength becomes almost impossible. If I had to summarize it using power scaling terminology, I would say that he could approach a boundless level of power, or at the very least, something that appears functionally limitless within the rules of his own universe. In practical terms, that would mean he could lift virtually any amount of weight, manipulate reality on an absurd scale, move at incredible speeds, regenerate from almost anything, and become effectively indestructible. The only real limit is whatever the character's imagination and the story itself allows. For all of these reasons, I believe SpongeBob is the single strongest character in the SpongeBob universe, and I hope future episodes continue to expand on his abilities with even more incredible feats.